I'm so grateful to you, Jim, for agreeing to lead tonight and next week. I just got home a couple hours ago from a women's retreat and a little exciting news to share. I gave a presentation about ecclesia to these women. I was one of the speakers at the retreat, and as a result, we had one confirmation who walked away with 10 journals to start her own circle, and several that are considering it. So that's exciting.
Well, they're on Etsy right now, so
But that was fun. And then next week I'm traveling and I'll be with our friends Sunil and Prafulla in New York. So I'll be joining from their house, I assume, next Sunday night. But Jim's taking a huge load off of me to just get to be here with you and participate rather than have to lead. So I appreciate that. And without further ado, Jim, I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Michelle. You've got to realize it's 4 o'clock here, not 7 o'clock. I haven't had dinner yet. And let me tell you, this conversation on chocolate has distracted me, but I'll try to stay away from it. It just made me think, hey, I need my dinner.
That's right. Oh,
I'm going to.
I'm sorry, I forgot to say, I'm just going to remind the group that we're going to let you take us down this path for a while, and then you'll let us know when you want to open it up for questions and comments and things, right?
Definitely. Well, I'm going to talk about the four Gospels, and after each one, there'll be time for discussion.
Okay. So we'll mute until you're ready for us to jump in.
Bye.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the New Testament, following the death and resurrection of Jesus, there was one major question that was going through all the early church people. Who was this man, Jesus? How are we to understand who he was? And what we see in the New Testament and other books that were written at that time are the answers people came up with. One premise in my mind when I think about the writing of the Gospels is the books of the Bible, Old and New, were written by normal human beings like you and me. They may have been brilliant in some cases. They had good minds. They had good language skills. They were good writers, but they were normal beings. If we had met them, we'd have say, hey, this was a normal person. They were inspired by God to write their understanding of the faith, but it was their choice, their words, their decision. I'm going to write this the best I can. So I think we'd find the four people who have written the Gospels were normal human beings. They had their own understanding of who Jesus was, and I think they believed God was calling them to put this into writing and into a story. And the story, I use the word portrait, and I don't mean a written picture of what he looked like. It's a picture, their description of how they understood he was. So when we're talking about the portraits of Jesus, it's not a picture thing, it's a verbal thing. And I also want to clarify one thing, that what I'm sharing with you tonight and next week is my understanding of the four Gospels. You may or may not agree with some of what I say, and that's fine. I don't expect people to agree. I just hope it helps you think about your understanding of who Jesus was and what he means to you. Now, the gospel we call Mark, and that's where we're starting, was the first of the gospels written in about the year 70, perhaps a year or two earlier. So this was 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The decade of the 60s, just before it was written, had really been a very painful one for the early church. As we know from reading, there were basically four leaders in the early church that are best known: Paul and Peter, James, and John. Well, in that decade of the 60s, James, who'd been the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, was killed, murdered by really probably the high priest in Jerusalem. So he was no longer. A couple of 3 years later, we don't know exactly, there was a big fire in Rome, And Nero, the emperor, wanted to blame it on somebody, so he blamed it on the Christians. And we're pretty sure that both Peter and Paul were killed by him in that time. So 3 of the top 4 leaders of the church were gone in the 60s. And as he come closer to the 70s and the war that was going on then, there was only one leader still alive among the leaders, and that was John. And he was living up in Ephesus and wasn't really involved at that point in the wider church. So here we had a group of early Christians trying to put this structure together. And the man that we call Mark decided to write a story of Jesus and his ministry and let this book, this story, serve as that which held the church together. It was something they could hang on to. They became a people with a story that was understood. Now, Mark basically had 2 sources. One source for his writing was the stories that people had told for 40 years from the time of Jesus. Stories went through the church here and there and everywhere. And Mark knew a lot more, I'm sure, than he wrote, but he chose which ones to put in and how to put them together. He was really a creative writer and did a good job. It wasn't something that was just given to him. He had to put the whole thing together. He had a second source of information, and that were the prophecies from the Hebrew Bible. The early church went through the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, but it was the Hebrew Bible and their scriptures, and they studied and they looked for references to the Messiah, and they came up with lots of things. And those prophecies came into the story in Mark and Matthew and Luke and John. They was part of how they were trying to understand who Jesus was. So what do we learn about Mark? Well, he was very popular in some areas. He was a teacher who used a lot of parables, was a respected teacher. He was a healer. There's many examples of him healing somebody. And he was also an apocalyptic prophet, meaning the end time is near, and let's be ready for it. That's less emphasis in Mark than the others, but it's there if you read chapter 13. We also know that Mark was an established Jew. Mark clearly places the story of Jesus within Judaism. We need to remember, Jesus was never a Christian. He was born a Jew, he lived a Jew, he died as a Jew. He didn't have any idea about Christianity. That came following his life. There's some stories that he assumes his readers understand the Old Testament and what came out of the Hebrew Bible. The baptism of Jesus, it took place near the Jordan River. Why was the Jordan important? Because that's where they crossed. The Hebrew people way back when crossed when they came into the promised land. The name of Jesus was the same in Hebrew and Aramaic as Joshua. Joshua was the one who led the people across the Jordan. And what did they say? Mark says that Jesus was tested for 40 days in the wilderness. The Jews spent 40 years in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. That isn't accidental. Mark is clearly telling the story in such a way that it came out of the Jewish background that they were all part of. He was considered Jewish through and through. But we also learn from Mark that Jesus was not very popular with his original neighbors and his family. He was not, and Mark was not very positive about the people of Nazareth and how they felt about him. There's one place where he writes, he left that place and came to his own town, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. Where did this man get all this? What is the wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not our sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. In other words, Mark is not telling a very good story about the people of Nazareth. And the idea of being a carpenter, we think of a carpenter, hey, that's somebody with good skills. A carpenter back then was like a farmer. a peasant, a low class. There was no respect for being a carpenter. That was just a job of somebody who threw wood together to make a living and barely could make it. So it was not a compliment when they said he was a carpenter. Mark was not very positive about the family of Jesus. He says at one point, then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, well, your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who, my mother and my brothers? Looking at those who sat around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. And another verse in that same chapter 3, when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he's gone out of his mind. So Mark tells us that the people of Nazareth didn't really have much respect for Jesus. His family didn't have much respect for him. And so he wasn't popular in their eyes. Now, Mark often portrays Jesus as very human. As I said, he called him a carpenter, which was a very normal job, a peasant job. Still, it was a human job. Jesus ate with the marginalized people of his society, the tax collectors and sinners. When the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And then it's a very normal thing, caring about people. And then a normal thing was in the prayer at Gethsemane, which is one of my favorite passages. Jesus took with him Peter and Paul and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I'm deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, what you want. Now, I find that to be a very human reaction, and one that I would guess most of us can understand. But this was obviously Mark's creation. Jesus didn't whisper to Peter after the prayer, well, you bet you can't guess what I just prayed. It was Mark's creation. This is how he wanted to describe Jesus, as one who was human in that way, who cared about others, but had the same normal reactions to things that you and I would. Mark also did not paint a good picture of the disciples. As I mentioned in Gethsemane, the disciples fell asleep while Jesus was praying, even when he asked them to stay awake. Later in Mark, it says Jesus calms the storm, and they didn't understand. And goes on to talk about the storm. And at the end, he says to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. So the disciples are not painted very pretty in Mark. They just don't understand what's going on. Another example of this is when he talks about the Son of Man was going to undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get me behind thee, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And of course, we all know the story of Peter's denial of Jesus later in Mark. Again, the disciples didn't get it. They weren't very smart. It's interesting, though, while the disciples didn't understand who Jesus was, one man did. The centurion, a member of the Roman army. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. Who doesn't understand Jesus? His family, his home synagogue, his disciples. Who does understand Jesus? The low and the outcasts, and a Roman soldier. In summary, in Mark's view, when you look at Jesus, He came to serve and to suffer and to die, and ultimately to triumph by following the divine will. So I say Mark's version of Jesus shows a lot of humanity, eating with the marginalized, his prayer of Gethsemane. And I think I would say Mark is my favorite gospel because of this. A son of God who was quite human and deeply cared about marginalized people. I find that to be a hopeful portrait of Jesus. It was his humanity and caring for all others that really has inspired me. So let's take a time for questions and comments now. Anything come to your minds as I talk about Mark?
I have. Oh,
Go ahead, Ed.
Anantha, you go then,
yeah.
Rick.
Tell me why Mark's gospel was placed as number 3 in the sequence of the gospel.
Number 2, you mean?
Or
yeah.
2. Sorry, 2. If it was written the earliest, the first gospel to be written.
Yeah, that's a good question, Anantha. The Gospels, though they're written in the 70s and 80s and up to about 90, really didn't get collected together as a group until a few years after that, maybe the turn of the century, 100, 110. We don't know exactly. But when they began to collect them together, several years later, Matthew was clearly the most popular. And therefore, Matthew was put first, Mark, Luke, and John after that. But they didn't think historically in the same way we do. We immediately want to ask, when was something written? What was written first? That was not a question that was important to them. It just wasn't the way their society thought. So Matthew was the most popular gospel, so it was put first. That's my answer to that. Can't prove that. When we write articles and things, we put the dates in and maybe who's written it. Mark's name is never in the gospel. And obviously the date it was written was never. Now we see Mark on the cover, on the heading, but that was put in by the church years later. They didn't call it Mark at first. That was probably 50 years later, about 120, when they began to name the various gospels, who wrote them.
If this is a question, if it wasn't until years later that they started to name them, what did they have them just numerical and have them as a reference?
We don't have much evidence of that because other people wrote things about it, and so we knew they knew about it. But whether they probably called Mark the Gospel and called the others the revisions or something, a later one. We don't really know the answer to that. There's just no historical evidence to tell us.
Jim, one of the things that I'm finding kind of interesting, excuse me, about this. By the way, nice job. That actually laid it out so that even a heathen like myself could understand this. But it seems that as you're describing Mark to us, everyone was kind of a jerk to Jesus.
Yes, if you look at it that way, I think that's true. Not everyone. The marginalized loved him.
Right.
The tax collectors and sinners that he went to eat with thought he was great.
But even his own disciples or the apostles,
yeah,
not like him very much.
Well, they liked him and respected him, but they didn't understand him.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
While you were talking with that, for a second I thought of all things, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Because Rudolph ended up saving the day, but all his fellow reindeer, apostles, disciples, thought he was a bit odd. And in the end, turned out being, one of the saviors of the thing. But I just find it really interesting the way that Mark kind of describes everyone.
It's not the way we initially thought of it that way.
Right.
The disciples were such heroes that we would think good things. Well, when you read Mark literally,
yeah.
By the way, I'm going to send to Michelle when the evening's over a list of all the scriptures I've quoted. So if you want to follow up on any of them, I'll tell you what they are, because I don't want to spend time dealing with it here. So, but she will get a list and she can email them out to you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Robert?
When Matthew completed his writings, about how long was it before he was killed? Or Mark, I mean, I'm sorry.
Well, before Mark was killed or before Jesus?
Yes.
It was
Well,
about
Mark.
40 years after Jesus was killed, is when he wrote.
Okay, then how long after that was he killed?
We don't know. We don't know
Okay.
Mark's ending at all. We can't even be sure it was Mark who wrote it. That's what the early church thought about the year 120. And we have no evidence one way or the other. I can't prove he didn't through evidence, but I can't prove he did. We call it Mark because we have no better option.
Okay. Same with Matthew too, I would imagine.
Yes. Luke and John are a little more likely. I'll talk more about that, but yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Antha?
So, to all of us in Ecclesia right now, we accept the Bible itself, the New Testament especially, is fallible and not exactly God's dictation or God's word. Jim, how do you, throughout your career, when you encountered people looking at you saying, the four gospels were written by men, I mean, that's blasphemy to some people, right? So how did you reason with them?
Well, I have been very unsuccessful
the
doing
inerrancy
that
of
now.
the Bible.
There's a lot of people that doesn't work. The nice thing, I can share this with this group because I know this group is open to listening to new ways. But I can remember going to seminary, and I started seminary in the year 1960. So I've been dealing with this for quite a while. I remember one class, the professor was talking about Luke, and he was saying that Peter's sermons in Luke were not really what Peter would have said. It was Luke's interpretation of what Peter said. And I can remember thinking, what's that guy saying? Of course it was Peter's. It's in the Bible, isn't it? I don't know how much longer it was before I realized that professor was right. What I'm saying is I didn't catch on to this all immediately. It's been a growth process. And what I'm sharing with you tonight is 64 years worth of thinking about it. It didn't all come at one moment. And I don't expect you all to pick up some things I'm saying if they're very different any faster. It takes a while for some of these things to sink in, and we grow.
Rachel?
I appreciate it because for me, the Bible was always just like, this is what it is, and this is what you accept, and that was how it was taught for me. And I started asking questions and wanting to understand, but nobody ever explained any of the history or what has been discovered or what is believed. It was always just like, read it. So I really appreciate you doing that. I love history and I love finding out about things, especially something like this. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I majored in history in college, so I'm like you. I wanted to look at things from a historical point of view. And that's why it began to make sense to me.
I think it's helpful when we can find resources that help add to the context of what was going on at that time, so that we're not just reading scripture in isolated in what am I trying to say? It's not the only thing. So we're reading that, but we also read something that is of a historical nature that gives us a bigger picture of what was happening in the culture or what was going on, with those people at the time. So we can think a little bit more critically in a healthy way about biblical scripture. But it's not always readily available. I think I've had the luxury of having some people around me that were studied more that way historically and could add that color to the story for me. And every time I was able to do that or be a part of perhaps a Bible study where someone was able to kind of give this extra insight, it just made it so much more interesting and brought it alive, but it was helpful too. And but I don't know that we easily know where to go find those kinds of resources. And so, thinking on that over the next week, Jim, if you or Dawn or Jay have ideas about some other things that we could email out to the group as other resources to read alongside what we study in our Bible studies and things. That way, give us some extra context that might be interesting and helpful.
Well, there are a lot of books out there that can be helpful, no question.
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes you don't even know enough to know what questions to ask.
And that's why if what I do tonight is helpful at all, it will maybe help you have a better understanding of the questions.
So far it's been tremendously helpful. You can just stop right here. I'm good.
Let's go on to Matthew, can we?
Please.
Matthew was written about 85, so therefore about 15 years after Mark, and therefore 45 years after the death and resurrection. It was probably written in the town of Antioch, which was up the coast from Jerusalem, up where Syria is now. And Syria was the second largest city in the Roman Empire at that time, and the church was a very strong one. So a lot of people were in that church. Matthew follows the outline of Mark, but adds a lot of other stuff. Michelle, can you put that chart up now? I put together a slide. If you could see that, you see right under the phrase Synoptic Gospels, you see Mark. And then below that to the left, you see Matthew with an arrow going down. Matthew followed Mark's outline. He has every verse that was in Mark, except for one little section, included in there. But you see the little letter M above Matthew. Matthew had some other sources. For example, that's getting better. Good, thank you. He had his infancy narratives. If you know the story about the wise men and some others, came out of what we call M. It's just a verbal thing to show he had a source of. And I've also put Luke up here because there's a similarity. Luke also follows Mark, the outline of Mark pretty good, but Luke has some sources of his own, which you see in the letter L up above it. We know the infancy stories and such. But then you notice the letter Q between Matthew and Mark. German scholars in the 17th and 18th century discovered, and that's where a lot of good study was going on at that time, there are certain passages that are in Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. And they say it came from a source called Q. Q is simply the German letter for quell, which was the German word for source. Matthew and Luke had a copy of Q, and they took a lot of stories out of it. And we know what some of those were. The Sermon on the Mount, although Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, a lot of things in common. And we know it was a literal written source because in some of those passages, Matthew and Luke are identical, word by word. And that would never have happened if it was just hearing stories. It's only when it was written down and they both had a copy of it that we could tell, yes, it had to be written because the words are identical. And as I said, there's stories like the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes and a lot of other stories that are in both. You can go ahead and take the slide down, Michelle. Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels. It begins with the genealogy of Jesus. which traces his heritage back to key people. And frankly, these verses are usually ignored. I've never heard somebody preach a sermon on the genealogy of Jesus as Matthew tells it. The first person in the genealogy is Abraham. And 14 generations later, we run into David. And 14 generations later, we run into the exile. And 14 generations later, we run into Joseph, the husband of Mary, the father of Jesus, of whom Jesus was born. Now, if you would trace each father and son through the Hebrew scripture books, it wouldn't come out to exactly 14. But Matthew wasn't concerned about, like we would with perfect history. He was seeking to establish that Jesus, the Messiah, was deeply rooted in Judaism. The 14, 14, 14 is there to show his close connection with his Jewish faith. Time and again, though, Matthew connects Jesus to the prophecies that appear in the Hebrew scriptures. He writes at one point, Mary will bear a son, and you to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place, he writes, to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, in this passage, Matthew is quoting the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament made about 200 BC, from the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah says in 7:14, a young woman is with child, and she will bear a son and will call him Emmanuel. It's interesting to note, when the word for young woman was translated into Greek, the word they used was more one that meant the virgin. So the original Old Testament, Isaiah really didn't say a virgin will. It said a young woman will. And yet the early church picked that up. And that's where the stories of the virgin birth came from. Matthew tells us that when the Messiah was to be born, King Herod went asking, where was he born? And they quoted Micah 2 and said, they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. And that was Matthew quoting Micah 2. This was the early church had a problem of, they knew Jesus was raised in Nazareth. That was pretty clear by a lot of stories. But they also knew, according to Micah, that he was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So that's how they got Joseph and Mary down to Bethlehem for the birth. They thought it had to come out of there because that's what the prophecy said. And then a little bit later in Matthew, Herod was seeking to find a baby and destroy him, which reminds you of, perhaps of the babies that Pharaoh killed with Moses. Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there till the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the prophet by the Lord through the prophet had said, out of Egypt I have called my son. This is a reference to Hosea 1. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. I called my son out of Egypt. And there's many other passages in Matthew where he says, all this happened in order to fulfill what God had declared through the prophet. The stories of the prophets influence the story of Jesus that we see in the New Testament. Now, I mentioned him being very Jewish, and Matthew certainly hits on that. There are many passages in Matthew that clearly talk about the importance of the law. The key verse is Matthew 5:17. Matthew tells us, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Matthew hits that point strong. A little later, he says, you've heard it said of those of ancient times, you shall not murder, but whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. I say to you, if you're angry with your brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. Sometimes Jesus updates the law, but he always affirms it. Matthew is very strong about that. Now, there was a lot of discussion in the early church at that time Did you have to become a Jew to be a Christian? And Paul gets into that with James pretty heavily. Matthew was saying that, yes, he was Jewish all the way. We've got to understand it that way. Another way we learn some things about Matthew, which I find fascinating, is to see how Matthew edits certain passages of Mark when he includes them in his gospel. The story of the baptism by John the Baptist has a couple of illustrations on this. Mark starts the story very simply. It happened at this time that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. But Matthew adds a couple of sentences to this. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. Then Matthew adds, John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he considered. The Markan story would sort of imply that John the Baptist had more authority than Jesus because he baptized him. Matthew wants to make it clear that Jesus was superior to John the Baptist by having John reluctant to baptize Jesus. The end of the baptism story shows a slight difference too. Mark says, a voice spoke from heaven, thou art my son, my beloved, on whom my favor rests. The voice in Mark was speaking only to Jesus. But in Matthew, he writes, a voice from heaven was heard saying, this is my beloved son. Matthew makes the voice from Jesus a public declaration, which others can hear, strengthening the image from Jesus. And another story I mentioned earlier about Nazareth and how they reacted. Mark reported the people were saying, where does he get it from? Is not this the carpenter's son, the son of Mary? Matthew is simple. Is not this the carpenter? Matthew is similar, but he says, is not this the carpenter's son? And are not all his sisters here with us? Whereas Mark said he was the carpenter, Matthew said he's the carpenter's son. As I said, the carpenter's not a particularly respected person, a peasant. Matthew wants to raise the image of Jesus, and that's one way he does it. It's just little things like that. At the end of the passage from Nazareth, Mark says he could work no miracle there. Matthew changes that slightly by saying he did not work many miracles there. Again, Matthew was raising the image of Jesus higher than Mark had done it. And there were many other places. I mentioned the one where Mark says, truly this man was the Son of God. Matthew takes the same story and adjusts it only slightly by saying, when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus, the man said this was truly a Son of God. So Matthew again raises the image slightly by suggesting there were many more soldiers to hear that affirmation. And we're going to bring this up again when we get to Luke. So what we see in Matthew is an author who really liked the story he read in Mark's gospel, but he wanted to emphasize that Jesus was rooted in the Hebrew tradition and was a stronger and more divine person than might be perceived by reading Mark's gospel. So let's open to comments and discussion on Matthew.
Rachel and then Sarah.
So just as how I'm getting it is that Mark was more of one to be more historical or more of the person to sit there and be like, this is how it was. This is what I know and what I remember. And Matthew's kind of the PR person to be like, we want to put that spin on it and let's make you look a little bit better than everybody's really thinking you are. Which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
That's just what I hear.
Yeah, but I would say Mark was also a PR person. He was trying to write a story that people would appreciate. Matthew just added some updates to it.
It's all marketing.
Well, that's a terrible thing to say, but in some sense, they were writing it for people to read and to learn from it. They were selling the church. They were saying we're important. What we've got here is good. Yeah, but you're right, Rachel. he
Go
did
ahead.
twist
Sorry.
on it.
It just makes me think of, because writing styles are such a huge thing with my family. My mom's a writer, my wife's a writer. I hate writing. But I do write. And like my mom is very flowery and she paints pretty pictures and she can always dress something up. But she'll still tell you the story. And my wife, she's more of like, I will tell you that story, and this is how that story went. And it's still a good story. And that's what this feels like. It feels like they're just two different writing styles, and one falls more towards a PR person, and one so like, I really want you to hear the story.
Yeah, and you've got to also remember, writing back then was much, much, much more difficult than writing is today. They couldn't go down to Staples and buy a package of paper to write on. They had, a lot of people were not educated enough to read or write. So that's why they had scribes, because these were people who could write. So anything written down then was much more complex and difficult to do than we would see it today. That's part of the context of the writing of it.
Sarah?
I appreciate your comments.
I remember I I did a religious studies minor in university, and I remember for the first Christianity course I took, the professor breaking down the Gospels in this way, and I was just really at the beginning of starting to struggle with Christianity at the time. So I went into this class where I understood that we were going to be looking at the Gospels in a different way and thinking, oh, I know the Gospels. I've been a Christian since I was 7 years old, and I've read all the Gospels, and this is going to be a class where I can just sit back and relax. Um, and uh, I remember hearing about the Q source, and that's what broke me, because I thought, this is the secret that we don't get told. That nobody. I had read the four Gospels like 100 times, and never really read them carefully enough to see all of the changes, that all of the differences between them that you've just said about these first two here. And my professor, went through, and I remember him talking about those differences, and then he said, and then there's another source. And then I thought, well, why does nobody tell us about this?
You raise a very valid question. There are two kinds of seminaries in America and Canada and what have you. One seminary teaches you, here's how you should think about the Bible. The literalists think, this is what it says, here's what you should think about it. The other kind of seminary, which I went to, and I imagine Roy did, I don't know where Roy went to school. Where'd he go?
He went to Bright Divinity.
Right. Okay. Teach you how to think about the Bible and how to study it and how to look at it. Not telling you, here's what you've got to believe, but here's how you understand it. But I'll tell you this, a lot of ministers who have been trained well and would understand basically what I've been saying tonight, wouldn't come as a surprise to them at all. But they have people in their congregations that are more fundamentalistic, and they don't want to upset them. And therefore, they don't do as much teaching of this that they might. And this is a real concern I've seen over the church over the years. We need to have done a lot more teaching than I think we have in many cases. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a disciple church that wasn't fundamentalist at all. And yet I had very little real Bible study when I went to seminary. I didn't even take it in college. I took other stuff. But anyway, it came in slowly.
Mm-hmm. Anantha?
Yeah, I think you hit much more fundamental characteristic of knowledge. In my view, it's it, it's very characteristic of the Judeo-Christian thought process, I think, um, where we are not taught in the sermons in the church or private conversations um, how to think critically about our own faith, right? And and I'm looking at it very distinctly, the Eastern mode of learning and Eastern religious thought, where the foundation itself is you are free to interpret the anthologies, the fundamental texts of Hinduism or Buddhism or Confucianism. You're born and raised on that premise that it's up to you to extract the meaning of this. And there's no priest, there's no structure of religious whatever, a church or papacy or anything that tells you how to think about the text. So is this a Western epistemology that we are looking at, or Jim, is it more than just what we are told in the church or not, but actually could be the character of Western learning?
Well, you make some interesting comments. I think a lot of religions have people who are very fundamentalistic and say, this is what you're supposed to believe because this is the way it is. And others, like you're sharing, say, here's how we understand it. You work out what you think. I would guess that type of category exists in most religions. I don't know enough about Hinduism to know whether you have fundamentalists in Hinduism who say this is what Hinduism means and this is the way you're supposed to understand God. Maybe you do. I simply don't have that background. I've certainly seen that in Christians and I know it in Jews. You can look at the Jews, you've got the Orthodox and you've got the Reform and then you have the conservative in between. Same issues as we have in Christianity. But I appreciate your comments. It's helpful. Want to go on to Luke?
I have a question. When you mentioned that the Old Testament said that Emmanuel would be born in Bethlehem, was he really born there, or was that just what they figured it was going to be?
I can only tell you my opinion, and I have no historical evidence. I suspect because he was raised in Nazareth, and that's where his family was, he was probably born in Nazareth. But because the prophet said they wanted to get that in their story. It's the same thing about going to Egypt. I doubt seriously whether they really went down to Egypt from Bethlehem. I think they were in Nazareth. The stories of Jesus' birth didn't come up till well after he was dead. They didn't ask about little kids of peasant kids, how they were born. That story just didn't come up. So these were stories the church put together.
Well, and I know King James made thousands of edits of things he didn't like, but many fundamentalists believe that is the actual word of God.
Oh, there's no question. I heard somebody say, if Jesus liked the King James, so do I. You're right. But I'll have to say this with the King James, and it wasn't the king himself, it was the scholars who did it.
Okay.
But they didn't have as good a text as we got later. So the Greek text they were following, they didn't have some that we now have. So they didn't get all the picture of it the way we could later.
Okay, thank you.
Ready for Luke?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to push, but just to get through it. If you could remember the chart that we saw earlier, we talked about Luke's sources and then the Q that was different. The first 4 verses of Luke tell us something about Luke. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, as one having a grasp of everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have a firm grasp of the words of which you've been instructed. Now notice the Theophilus, very Roman name. Also worth noting that Luke is considered to have written Acts. And in the first verse of Acts, he says, in the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. He starts Acts out with a reference again to Theophilus. And it's clear from even the beginning, and we'll run into some other examples, that Luke was writing a story in such a way that it would be acceptable to the Roman people and not just to Jewish and Christian followers. He was saying, in a sense, we're good people and we're helpful to the world. You don't need to be afraid of us and worry that we're trying to overthrow the empire or damage it. So Luke was writing a story in such a way to help get into the minds of the Romans in a positive way. Now, Luke obviously is well known for his birth narratives, Zechariah and Elizabeth, the angel speaking to Mary, Joseph and Mary's trip to Bethlehem, and the shepherds hearing the heavenly host singing. And Luke in chapter 3 has his own genealogy of Jesus. He starts with Jesus, though, and goes backwards rather than starting with the origin. And he goes back, and he goes all the way back to Adam. And why did he do that? Well, he was saying, whereas Matthew was saying Jesus was Jewish, he goes back to Abraham. Luke was saying Jesus goes back to Adam. He's a representative of the whole human race. So Luke has a broader view, not just Jewish, but Jesus is key to a follower of the human race, really. Now, Luke also adds a couple of resurrection stories that weren't in Mark, and these came from the L source I showed, the walk to Emmaus and the appearance to the disciples of Jerusalem. But I always find it interesting to note where Luke's writing differs from Mark and Matthew. For example, the baptism of Jesus, I noted how Matthew has John saying he needs to be baptized by Jesus, not the other way around. Luke deals with that same issue by simply not mentioning John the Baptist. Now, when all people were baptized, and when Jesus had been baptized, the heavens opened. So again, Luke adjusts that to fit his own image. He doesn't want to give John the Baptist credit. He doesn't even mention him. But the overall picture of Luke, of Jesus as Luke shows him, it is a model of compassion. He willingly forgives sinners. He comforts the downtrodden. He heals the afflicted. Luke's Jesus is particularly attentive to social and economic justice. Let me give you some examples. Luke has a long middle section that came from L, as we saw there, that has a lot of parables and stories that are not in either Mark or Matthew. For example, one of these is the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this parable, Luke shows a man from a people who were normally disliked by the Jewish people. The Samaritans were not respected at all, and he was the hero of the story. If you know Clarence Jordan's story of the Gospels, he has the Cotton Patch translation, and he wrote about the black man who rescued a man who had been robbed and beaten while walking from Atlanta to Albany. That's what the first readers of Luke would have heard. A marginalized person being the one who cared about a person who was in need. That was the way Luke told the story. Another parable is the prodigal son, about a father who dearly loved his son, who left home and wasted his inheritance. Luke told us that God was like that, his love and respect for all of us. Luke also has a more respectful attitude toward women than do the other Gospels. In the infancy narratives, who are the heroes? Elizabeth, Mary. And Mary quotes a passage from Hannah that was featured in 1 Samuel. And just after the parable of the Good Samaritan, you notice Jesus enters the house of Martha and Mary. And when Martha complained because her sister would sit and listen to Jesus while Martha was stuck in the kitchen with all the work there, Jesus was very supportive of Mary, saying she had chosen the good portion. Notice Jesus did not say that Mary should keep in her place and stay in the kitchen, which you sometimes hear in our era today. Another example is related to the video that Michelle showed a couple of weeks ago with a professor who spoke about the parable of the lost coin, following the parable of the lost sheep. Actually, that was Luke, only in Luke that the parable of the lost coin appears. Luke has the parable of the lost sheep and then the parable of the lost coin. And the parable of the lost coin was a woman who couldn't find the coin in her home, was every bit as important as the male shepherd. It was another example of Luke's concern to place women in important roles. I mentioned also earlier Luke's interest in helping the Romans have a positive attitude towards the church. You know, in the trial before Pilate, Jesus was accused of saying he was king of the Jews. When Jesus did not respond to Pilate's asking him if that were true, Mark said, Pilate wondered. Matthew has a similar answer to that. Matthew says, Pilate wondered greatly. But Luke adds a verse here saying, and Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, I find no crime in this man. This clearly says Luke's concern of not seeing Jesus as a criminal, even though everyone knew he'd been crucified by the Romans. And another verse confirms this. Just after the death of Jesus, Mark says, and when the centurion stood before him, he said, truly, this man was a son of God. Matthew says the same thing. Truly, this was a son of God. But here's what Luke wrote. Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. Once again, Luke trying to emphasize that Jesus had not been a criminal. He was innocent, and that the Romans could respect him and respect the Christian faith. That was clearly a message Luke was trying to get across. Okay, let's talk about Luke a little bit. What questions come to mind on that, or comments?
Rick.
It seems that Luke is trying to make him the more, I don't want to say softer, but more understanding benevolence.
Absolutely. Absolutely in Luke.
You know, yeah, I mean, because you look at the way he was in Mark, and then look at how either Jesus was changed or how his perception had been changed along the line. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, now Luke and Matthew both followed Mark closely.
Right.
They liked Mark's gospel. They're just putting a little different twist on some of it.
Right. Kind of softening some of the edges.
That's right. Okay. From their perspective.
Right, exactly.
Their portrait. And that's why I describe it this way.
Yeah, thank you. And you all thought I could never be serious.
You've proven yourself, Rick.
Thank God that's over.
At least when you're sitting there, I don't see those little creatures behind you that seem to be giving all the rest of us the finger. But
well, there is that.
Yeah.
They want to learn. Oh, no, Jim, I'm going to ask you a quick. And I think you want to. And go out. I'll get a question for you later, Jim.
Annette?
I'm just wondering, how much do we know about Luke and his background and where he came from?
Well,
his personal history that he turns into a compassionate view of Jesus and his perspective of Jesus. as a forgiving, benevolent, person.
You raise a good
And
question.
yeah,
Obviously, we have no historical documentation about Luke. Now, the early church wrote about Luke, or the church has. The fundamentalists always immediately would say, well, Luke was the doctor who was in Acts. May have been, because there are some passages in Acts that are we passages later on in the story, as if it was written by somebody who was there. We don't know historically for sure, but I think there's some evidence it might have been Luke who was the doctor who they talked about. But that's guesswork. It's best common sense. There's no proof of it. Again, Luke didn't write his name in the Bible in his book. That was added later. It's what the church thought. But there weren't any newspaper articles to go back to. There were no tapes of previous sessions that they could look at. It was best possible guess.
Why do you think they felt it necessary? Why not just leave it as text ABCD number 1? Why not?
Wow.
Why have to attribute it to somebody they didn't really know?
Well, one of the criteria the early church had for deciding what book should be in the Bible. By the way, it took 300 years before the New Testament was finally put together. It didn't happen until well in the 300s. But one of the criteria was this written by somebody who knew Jesus or somebody who could witness somebody who knew Jesus? That's why Mark, who knew Peter, and Peter was considered a witness. And the same with Luke. Luke would have known some of them. So that was the criteria they used. They wanted to know, did this person really know Jesus? There was one book that didn't make it in the New Testament that would have been a good one, except they realized it was written by an assistant to the bishop at 150. And they know he couldn't have been with Jesus, so they didn't put it in. So that was one of the questions they were asking. Was this really tied to Jesus?
Rachel?
Was the chapter, sorry, thank you. Was the chapter or the book that was written by the bishop, was that ever released? Or is it just held and released as like a story or?
No, it was not a gospel like about Jesus, but some of the early copies of the New Testament had it in it in the 2nd century, but finally they took it out. As I said, it took 300 years for them to pull together all of the New Testament. And so ones were going in and out all the way along. And these early ones, when they were written, they weren't considered scripture. They were letters by Paul or were they stories by others. And they all had to get copied by scribes because they didn't have printing. They didn't exist. So there would be copies made. And sometimes a scribe would put his or her, I assume they're his basically back then, own comments in the footnotes. And sometimes there's things the scribes wrote in that got into our own books. And we could go to that's a whole nother story, but it could certainly be done because they didn't consider scripture. It was just a writing. So why can't I add to it what I think? I can write this better than he did. So he changed it. We see, and in the early texts of the Bible, when you begin to study them, you find these differences. There are thousands of variations of scripture, of passages in the Gospels, thousands, because somebody else wrote it down and copied it wrong, and that copy was copied again, and some of them got in, and it's a very complex thing, but it's a lot of differences.
Jim, is there when we're talking about all the different rewrites and edits and everything, and earlier you and Robert were talking about the King James Bible, is there either a preferred Bible or a Bible that is considered a cleaner version?
Well, it all depends on who's considering.
Right.
I use the RSV, or did younger now the new RSV, simply because that, when I was going to seminary, was the most respected one. There have been changes since, and they've tried to put it in other translations, and I have no problem with that. But you got to realize every time you read a translation, you're getting someone's person, their understanding of what was in there. So the better translations were those made by scholars where a lot of people looked at it and talked about it. That's one reason I like the RSV. There wasn't just one person writing it. You see the Schofield Bible, well, that's one man's opinion.
Right.
I'd rather have a lot of it. There's a whole study we could do sometime on the text of the Bible. All kinds.
Be interesting.
I'd like to hear that.
We can talk about doing a brief one in the future if you want to, Michelle.
That'd be fun.
Be awesome.
You know, because the thing I wonder about is every time you do a retranslation or a re-understanding, how much do you lose something that was done 300, 400, 1,000 years ago?
Every time.
Yeah.
You know, but again, if it's people saying, I'm trying to work out my own understanding, I accept that.
Okay.
Or trying to say, I'm right and you're wrong if you don't agree with me, that's where I get frustrated.
Right. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The further back you go, you know, I don't say more accurate, but the more timely it actually might have been.
Yeah. Do you want to go on to John and try to get through that tonight too, Michelle?
Well, I don't know. We've got 10 minutes. Do y'all want to start, John, or hold it for next week?
Who wants to go to the John?
Keep going. We're loving this. Keep going, Jim.
John traditionally has been thought of as written by the disciple John, the son of Zebedee. I doubt that for one basic reason. He would have been born at least say the year 10, if he was 19 when Jesus' ministry was. He was the son of a fisherman. Children of fishermen didn't go to school. They went to work with their dad about 10 or 12 years old. He would not have had any formal education. The Gospel of John is written in very high quality Greek, perhaps the best Greek of the whole New Testament. I don't picture a 12-year-old boy going later to graduate school and learning how to write in Greek at a scholarly level. I think it's unlikely. Plus, he would have been 70 or 80 years old at the time it was written. But I think he was part of the group, and the writer knew him because when he moved to Ephesus in the early 50s, a group developed around him, and I suspect that the Gospel of John grew out of that group. So connecting it to his name is okay, even though I doubt that he was the writer. Now, I have to admit, when I was serving as a minister, I did not like the Gospel of John, and I did not like to preach on texts from John. And it was frankly because I didn't like the portrait that he portrayed of Jesus. I like Mark and Matthew and Luke, Jesus, a caring man who related to marginalized people of society. I see the Jesus of John as being arrogant. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And I never warmed up to that. But one day I reread a verse in John that I'd read before but didn't really understand. John 20. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. And I realized two things from that. John was preaching. He was writing that in order to get people to believe. But he also was saying, by not saying it, I'm not a historian. I'm not a journalist. I'm not trying to tell you exactly what was said and done 60 years ago. I'm preaching so you will believe. And I think he had a deep Christian commitment. And he really believed Jesus was the way and the truth and the life. But he began to think, how am I going to write this in a story in a way that people will really hear and understand? And he came up with a literary idea. I'm going to switch from third person to first person. Rather than writing in there, he is the way, the truth, and the life, I'm going to have Jesus say, I am the way and the truth and the life. And you know, it worked because millions of people have come to the gospel and to Jesus because of reading the Gospel of John. And once I realized this, I began to have a far greater understanding of the Gospel of John because I realized he wasn't trying to be historical. In that sense, he was preaching and trying to get people to believe. And he also created a Jesus who was more divine. He was still human. He writes in there that Jesus wept, but he emphasizes the divinity. And the classic illustration of this for me comes from the story of the prayer in Gethsemane. We remember Jesus went, Mark and Matthew tell about, and Luke telling about going to the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible that this hour might pass. Father, for all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, what you want. Now here's John's view of that scene. Now my soul is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, but I will glorify it again. A very different portrait of Jesus. He's talking about the divine side of Jesus. He didn't ignore the humanity, but he was emphasizing how Jesus was divine and seeing life from that way. There are other differences between John and the Synoptic Gospels. I mentioned about his baptism. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. In Luke, it says Jesus is baptized, but it doesn't say by whom. In John, there is no baptism. Because from John's perspective, Jesus didn't need to be baptized. He was already born divine. Why did he need what the baptism where that announces divinity? Another story is the temptations. Mark mentions the temptations, but doesn't say anything about them. Matthew and Luke each have stories of the temptations, 3 each, slightly different. John doesn't have the story of temptations. Jesus was divine. He wouldn't be tempted, if anything. It's also noting that John did not have Jesus tell parables. His teaching were longer meditations and sort of speeches, not really trying to reach the people around him, but to make points that John wanted to make. So I say John has a very different picture of Jesus. And there's a lot more that could be said, but I won't try to tonight. It was a divine Jesus and one that was important for the church, but it was different than Matthew and Mark and Luke. So, comments?
Anantha?
So this is fascinating, Jim, because it's colliding and colluding actually with my journalism history lecture. If Michelle can even remember even 1% of my my communication and society class, we discussed the earliest historians were journalists. And journalism as a word did not exist in English language. So we call them scribes. They were the scribes who wrote. And now scribes were learned people who knew how to write, and they knew the alphabet of any language. I mean, those were the original historians who actually took a quill to write on a bark, a smooth bark of a paper, which was not existent at that time, paper. So I'm thinking, I mean, how could they have stored such a complex compilation, documentation of history of Jesus and what he said? I mean, they were reporters too, right? I mean, the people who wrote the Gospels were also reporters. They had to be scribes. And they had to be intellectuals of the day. These were not poor peasants that Jesus reached into. to say, "Come follow me." Um, so it kind of it is a fascinating aspect of how could they have done that before the invention of paper, invention of ink, invention of the printing press. How could they have documented the early history of Jesus? How did the church even gather that documentation
The
from?
oral tradition was very strong back then.
Okay, okay. So the oral tradition had to then be transcribed and put into writing, and then later on in the 14th century, 1445, when Gutenberg invents the printing press, then they get printed. So it's just an incredible journey that the printed word went through to keep Jesus alive.
I want to make one point in connection with what you're saying. As I said, it took 300 years to put the Bible together. But about the year 160 or 175, there was a man by the name of Tatian who was from Assyria. And he wrote a book which is called the Diatessaron. And what he did, he took the stories of Jesus from all four of the Gospels and put them into one book. It's like, why do we need four books? We can put the stories into one. And for a while, that was popular. But then the church rejected it because the church said, we want all four books of the Gospels. And we know there's some differences in there, but we want people to work through their own. And I really admire the early church for not settling on just one version, but wanted all four Gospels in there. They had a wisdom about them that would help people think and come to their own faith. And I really appreciate the early church for that. I think that they had some wisdom that was beyond their day.
So Jim, what's your view on all the books that were not included in the Bible? The Apocrypha, or I don't know what you call
Yes.
that. You divinity folk, know that more. Apocrypha version of the Bible. Okay, how uh, how did they get to be included? The four Gospels, and one was, you said, not included. And how many were there, and how many actually found it into the Bible? And
That's a story for another night.
yeah, I'm sure. I mean,
It's
that maybe you could actually do another session completely on Apocrypha.
on, well, the growth of the New Testament and what got in and what didn't, and why did they get in and why did they not? Yeah,
Yeah.
that could be another whole session.
Absolutely appreciate that.
I don't want to get into it tonight because there's not time.
No. I don't want you to. That's a whole different complex.
Yeah.
This has just been fascinating.
A lot of questions around all of this. So we really appreciate it, Jim, and to have not just your wisdom and years of experience with your own study and exploration, but emphasizing I think, the importance of approaching the Bible and, as my dad has said, as a great adventure, but particularly not as the final, this is it. And as we see, I think part of when we do that, it creates problems because then we go, but these things don't match up, right? It opens the door for more questions and confusion. But if you approach it as just one big adventure, and as you have so eloquently presented tonight, I think we see that it is really just a lot of guys that said, this is good, important stuff. We need to write it down. But at the end of the day, it is four uniquely different portraits of Jesus. I just think this was just so wonderful. Thank you.
And there's 7 or 8 more Gospels written that weren't included.
Right.
Like
And
the
that would get to some
things.
questions that Ampa said.
That's what I'm
Right.
fascinated about.
Yeah.
We're all kind of curious about why Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, all these other gospels didn't make it in. Was it politics? Was it power and control?
Yes,
Control
yes, and
the
yes.
narrative,
Yes,
right?
yes, and yes.
The Gospel of Stash.
So, so yes, more. We want more.
Oh,
Yes, please.
I was thinking of the disciple Thomas, who supposedly in 52 AD arrives on the eastern shores of India in the current state of Kerala and started 4 churches, which are now called Marthoma churches, which is Thoma is Thomas in the Indian, one of the Indian language. What was he thinking as the disciple of Christ in India while he was there? What was he writing about? I mean, about Jesus. I mean, what was he preaching to the Indian crowd about the teachings of Jesus? And evidently, he wrote a gospel and never included in the Bible. So I just get fascinated by this, politics of epistemology, how the origin of ideas get excluded or included, especially in the Bible. I mean, so you have Vyasa, single author of Mahabharata, okay, the holiest of the text, which includes Bhagavad Gita in the middle of the epic battle of the good and the evil. I mean, this is like an incredible mega text of Hinduism, right? But it's a single author. At least there's no confusion as to what was included, what was not included. But Hinduism never says this is a definitive imagination of what your holy book should be. This is how you should think. Nobody tells you that. You are free to interpret Mahabharata the way you want to interpret. Transfer it to our biblical heritage. We are told specifically, these are not included in the Bible, these are included in the Bible, so you have to follow these texts. That creates to me a fantastic scenario to learn more from you, Jim, what in the future of our ecclesia session. I just need to know what you think about all the politics of interpretation.
You could cover a couple evenings just dealing with what you just brought up.
Okay.
I put in the chat a link to one that's it's called the Other Bible. Thank you, Rick. He gave me this years ago. I have yet to finish pouring through it. About that thick, but it has all these other texts that we've been referring to tonight. So if you are curious of reading the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the other Gospels, among other things, other texts, those are compiled in this particular book called the Other Bible. So for those who want some light bathroom reading, there you go.
Thank you.
I'm sure you can find it other places, but I just kind of Googled it. That's the version that has all of these in it.
Well, I gave you that merely to suck up in the beginning to make it look like I was actually interested in ecclesia and being friends and that kind of stuff.
Oh, it worked. I fell for it.
Yeah, well, had I known.
Was it for the dinners? Was it for the free dinners, Rick?
No, the dinners were contractually obligated.
So since our Eastern sage has arrived, Ranu, maybe later on she and I can have a session on how texts of Hinduism, are interpreted or looked at by women in one way, men. There's a beautiful book published by Cambridge University called Many Ramayanas. The Ramayana is another holy text, but it said many Ramayanas written by a woman author. And so she kind of describes how women approach Ramayana, how men approach. I mean, it's like a fantastic way of looking at the bad guys as the good guys. You know, Ravana, the epic evil guy who wants to defeat Lord Rama, is worshipped as a god himself. The villain becomes God because of certain many Ramayana interpretations. So it's just fascinating in the text how Bible can be, interpreted and written, and how disciples of Christ remember him 50 years later when they wrote the Gospels. I mean, these are like fascinating historical, imagination for me.
Ranu, anything to add?
I not much at this time, but I think the storytelling has it's a human condition, how we carry forward the lessons and the stories, and the older the stories, the more important oral tradition has been. And but what I can at least state in terms of the texts that are the Vedic or the Hindu text is that they were written in, I guess you can call it like sort of like iambic pentameter, if you want to call it that way. And because they were written in such poetry, they've been memorized. And so it's like a song. It's like learning a song, and the song gets passed down from generation to generation to generation over literally thousands of years, 5,000 years now. So there's some power to that, the science behind the understanding and the carrying forward of information, which is not unusual, I'm sure, in other faiths. But that is one thing I can tell you. And there's a lot of uh, even how scripture is read and written, and how one reads it, and maybe the different versions. I would be interested to understand maybe in the how in the Christian text, as English, maybe one language, how it's been modified, or how the rhythm of when you're reading a scripture, how it sounds. And there's something I can tell you from some of these other ancient types of faiths, that the sound, the intonation, the rhythm that it's written, what tone that you use is extremely important. And I think it's not just to have it how it sinks into your system as a human being, or how it resonates when in the universe when the words are uttered, but it's also to carry forward with memory, right? Because when you hear it morning after morning, or festival after festival, then it sinks into your system. Mm. And from birth until death, and maybe even in the womb, you've always been in that. You can be a part of that knowledge. Mm. We're using the human sensory system to be able to absorb it. It's fascinating. Mm-hmm. Excuse me.
Well,
it's interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say it's interesting that you say that, Ronan, because they're now finding that when they talk about past like family traumas and things like that, that it can be passed on by like generational trauma. They are now finding that that is something that is passed on in your genes in the womb, and it is passed on to generation. And there's more than just that that's inside. That's only the part that they've been really able to work on and document. But they've seen that there's more to it than just being like, oh, it's a baby knows nothing. There's actual genetic programming that's already been put in.
And I just read this. Remember, I think I told the group once that there is somebody in my circle who is a QHHT practitioner, quantum healer, Dolores Cannon School. I mean, she's Indian, meaning this woman. And speaking of the Ramayana, she's had 2 cases now where somebody has come in with like physical pain, specifically headaches. And she's been able to have them go into this, and it's a new word that I learned, but it's a somna ballistic um, setting. Like they go into this where the body speaks through this experience. And he went very quickly into a state where he went into the Ramayana, one of the stories, and where there was somebody who had been injured or the attempt of being killed with an axe or something, or some injury to the head. And he relived this whole thing and was able to iterate this during this session, this QHHT session, which was just like a week ago. This is what she posted on her Facebook page. And he expressed it, and then he said, "You got to take the axe out." And so she said, "Okay, I'll do it." And then she kind of like did this thing where she took the motion and took it out. He's free of the migraines. These are chronic migraines that he was having for decades. And there was another story like that. So this generational trauma, there's something you think that this can't be real. And when she said that, I was really amazed. So and yes, the science now is starting to show so much more of this translation, right? I mean,
Yeah, they really are.
and our ancestral situation is such that, what are we as human beings? We are just transport hatred. We're like the vehicles for souls that, the energy that comes to us and through us, that is, you can't destroy or create energy, right? It's already in place. Maybe the black hole takes it. I don't know, but that's something that's been kind of studied and understood. So it's very interesting. So this whole interpretation, like why is gospel, why are scriptures and these repetition and now that we have paper and books, why are they so important? It tells a story. And not just that you're living it. You might have lived it already. You may have lived it in a past life. You may be that conduit to bring it back to life in today's world, which is really, truly fascinating.
Or you might be the cause of all of it.
All right. Well, we need to
Oh,
let some folks go.
You mean I don't have any more comments I need to make, if that's what you're asking.
Do you want to close this with prayer or sending out in some way?
Sure. We thank you, God, for the gift that we have been given of stories of our faith. May it speak to our hearts and lead us to feel closer to you and to live as you would have us. Send us out with your love and your caring. Amen.
Amen.